Hey, so thank you all for joining us on this worldwide lab meeting of the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium. I'm Cathryn Lewis. I'm Professor of Statistical Genetics at King's College London and co-chair of the Major Depressive Disorder Working Group in the PGC. Just to remind you that this talk is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the PGC's YouTube channel later. So we're delighted to welcome to today's Worldwide Lab meeting Dr. Niall Boyce, who is Head of Field Building in Mental Health at Wellcome. And if you're wondering what field building is about, I think Niall is going to give you the answer to that during this seminar. You may know Niall from his previous role at The Lancet, where he was senior editor and then founded Lancet Psychiatry, which he edited for 7 years. And he then moved on to Wellcome, and he's been there since 2021. So Niall's going to give us an overview of Wellcome's plans using strategic funding in mental health to create a step change in anxiety, depression, and psychosis. And he'll give us an overview of Wellcome's initiatives here and leave plenty of time for Q&A. And you can either put your questions into the Q&A button at the bottom here, or if you just want to put up your hand when we get to the Q&A session, we can also bring you on live into the webinar. And on that note, I will hand over to you, Niall. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cathryn, and thank you for inviting me to talk. Thanks to everyone online for joining us. I'm going to share my screen, so you should be able to see some slides. You should be able to see, great, you can see the title slide. So what I'm going to do is to talk about mental health at Wellcome. This is going to take around 35-40 minutes, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions you have or discuss anything you'd like. The first thing which I'm going to do for those of you who aren't familiar with Wellcome is to give you a brief introduction to the institution. Now, Wellcome is a global charitable foundation. It was established in 1936 upon the death of Henry Wellcome, who is the gentleman in the picture on the left-hand side of the screen. And Wellcome was a pharmaceutical magnate who, when he died, left his money to medical research. And that money was invested, and it is with the dividends of that investment that Wellcome funds all of the work that it does. So Wellcome is politically and financially independent. It has no living founder, and this makes us really a very maneuverable organization, which means that we are able to identify and meet the challenges, the rapidly evolving challenges to health in the 21st century. So what do? We do all kinds of things. We aim to improve health for everyone, and we do this in all kinds of ways. We do this by funding research, which is really what I'm going to be talking about today, but also we build partnerships, we have advocacy campaigns, we have a whole policy unit, all to support science and to solve health challenges and to improve human health. We are based in London, and you can see the picture there of our office on the Euston Road, which is directly next door to the Wellcome collection. So, a couple of years ago, Wellcome reorganized, and it reorganized to settle on what it saw as really the big health challenges of the next 10 to 20 years. So the first thing to say is that although I'm going to talk in detail about these health challenge areas, and in particular mental health, we do still have a sizable amount of money in discovery research. And discovery research is really the sorts of blue skies, very ambitious research questions, everything from cellular biology right through to social questions, that discovery research covers areas of mental health which are not the focus of the mental health program itself. So when I talk about the areas of focus in mental health, please bear in mind that we're not excluding Wellcome altogether from other areas of mental health. Those are just going to be covered by discovery research. So in addition to discovery research, the main challenges identified were infectious disease, which I think is unfortunately now obvious to all of us, climate and health, again, very obvious, and then mental health. And of course, these three areas will interact with each other. Now, as Cathryn mentioned in the introduction, I had worked at the Lancet for many years. I'd worked there since 2010. Before that, I was a psychiatrist in the NHS. And when I started in mental health care almost 20 years ago, mental health was certainly very neglected clinically, with very little money. Unfortunately, that situation continues. It was also still extremely stigmatized. In terms of research, it wasn't getting much money either, and it wasn't getting much attention. You couldn't give away mental health stories to the media. If at medical school, you said that you wanted to specialize in psychiatry and mental health, the general response would be, why on earth would you want to do that? It was a very low status area, it's fair to say, clinically and in terms of research. And I think it's a mark of how much mental health has changed over the past decade and a half, that now it is in the media all the time. It's something which a lot of people are very interested in, especially younger people, I've found. And then the idea that an organization with the resources, the huge financial resources and resources of outreach and of people that Wellcome has, would be investing this much in mental health was, to me, truly remarkable. And it's a sense of how far we've come as a specialty. And that was one of the reasons why I decided to join this particular project. But of course, as they say, with great power comes great responsibility. If we have now a moment of mental health research, if we have a moment which is unlike any other, which I've known certainly in my lifetime, we have to capitalize on it. We have to show results now. And that's really what we're geared towards in Wellcome, is actually getting results which improve lives. So we have to focus somewhere. Mental health is, of course, a very broad field, but we have to focus somewhere that we can then be confident of making a change. So we have decided to focus on early stage anxiety, depression, and psychosis, early intervention in these conditions. Why is that? Well, I don't need to go through the numbers as to how much mental health problems affect people's lives. I think everyone on this call will be familiar with that. We know that mental health problems are in the top 10 of causes if you look at global burden of disease, and we know that if you drill down within that and look at what the bulk of that consists of, the very big contributors, the biggest contributors are in terms of anxiety, depression, and psychosis. So they're common, they have a big impact. We also know one of the curious things about mental health problems, of course, is they all tend to happen at around the same stage in life, around late adolescence, early adulthood. And the hope then is that intervening at this stage in these first episodes of anxiety, depression, and psychosis will stop people being held back by those problems later on in life. Of course, the thing about the age of onset of mental health problems is that this is also a very exciting, but also a very fragile point in people's lives. It's the point at which people are going to higher education and getting first jobs and first serious relationships, leaving home. And an episode of severe mental illness can have a really derailing effect on someone's life. So the aim is to prevent that derailing effect and to intervene early for a much better result later on. Now, of course, we do have treatments, and very effective treatments. And one thing which I don't want to do is to do down or to talk down what we currently have in terms of mental health treatments. Medicine has done some amazing things in terms of mental health over the past century. However, we know that there are limitations as well. We know that these treatments, antidepressants, antipsychotics, psychotherapies, don't work for everyone. We know that they have side effects, and we know that these side effects are often very problematic. I think to some extent we're only now really beginning to appreciate how serious these side effects can be for some people, to the extent that they stop engaging with the treatments. And then the third item here is the one which I'm increasingly seeing as being hugely important in terms of really moving mental health science and mental health treatments into the next century, which is that at the moment, we can give someone an antidepressant drug, or an antipsychotic drug, or cognitive behavioral therapy, or any other kind of treatment, And we're not really choosing it on a basis other than we intuitively think that's what might work. We have an evidence base for the treatment, but as for personalizing it to the individual, as for saying what will work for you specifically, we don't have that. And when I was in practice, I saw the situation, and I'm sure a lot of people on this call have, where you see someone who is having an episode of psychosis, maybe a first episode of psychosis, and you try an antipsychotic drug and that doesn't benefit them. You then try another antipsychotic drug and that doesn't benefit them either. And at that point, you can then try clozapine, which, as we know, is a very effective antipsychotic medication. But in order for the person to access that treatment, which was going to work for them, they had to go via 2 treatments which didn't work for them, which might have given them only side effects and no beneficial effects, and taken weeks, months, sometimes years doing so. So to my mind, stratifying people in terms of prognosis, in terms of treatment, I think is a huge advance which we could make in terms of mental health science. And that's something which, as you'll hear, we're very interested in. So what is the strategy of our program? So I'm going to start right at the top with our grand vision, and then I'm going to boil down to specifics. So the first thing to say is that our vision is of a world in which no one is held back by mental health problems. So when I say held back, you'll remember what I said earlier about these mental health problems happening at a very important, pivotal stage in life, and the potential for people to be derailed, the trajectory of their lives not to be what they wished it to be because they've experienced a mental health problem. We don't want that to happen. We don't want people to be held back. So how are we going to do this? Well, a step change in early intervention in anxiety, depression, and psychosis, because, as I've said, these conditions are common and they contribute to a great deal of the global burden of disease based around mental health problems. And how are we going to do this? Well, there are several pillars here. There are 3 pillars. The first thing is that we need to understand. So we need to understand how and why mental health problems develop. We need to understand the pathways in and the pathways out. And sometimes our interest would be in how treatments work. It's one of the curious things about a lot of mental health treatments, which is that we figured out that they work, and our understanding of why they work is still lagging behind somewhat. Is it possible to understand a bit more about why they work, which might uncover some mechanisms which we could then refine and utilize to come up with better treatments, for instance? We also need to understand about the natural course of conditions. How do they evolve? This thing we call spontaneous recovery, well, what exactly is that and how does that work? So understanding is one of the pillars of what we do. And then, as I mentioned, stratification, the ability to not just say this treatment tends to work for people with depression or anxiety or psychosis, but based on your individual characteristics, whether those are your demographic characteristics or whether it's a biomarker of some sort, I have a reasonable degree of confidence that this treatment will work for you specifically. And the third thing is we just need some new interventions. Again, I don't want to do down the effectiveness of the treatments that we have. I really don't. But I sometimes look at mental health practice and I say, okay, when were the treatments we use introduced? Well, we have ECT, of course, very controversial treatment sometimes, but that was introduced in the 1930s. We have lithium from the 1940s. We have antipsychotics from the 1950s. If we want to get up to date, I guess we could SSRIs from the 1980s. It's pretty clear we need some new treatments. New treatments maybe which are a bit more effective, maybe which are more tolerable in terms of side effects, and certainly which give people a much broader choice and a much better chance of recovery. So that's how we're going to achieve the step change, and there are various enabling elements within that. And I'm going to go from right to left here, so I can talk a little bit more about field building. I mentioned the policy work earlier. We need to really get in policymakers worldwide, not just the idea that what we need is better service delivery, which of course we do, but also that there is a need to invest in research, that we do need new treatments, that improving mental health worldwide isn't just about implementing what we have, it's discovering new and discovering better. The other activity that we want is improved data. So at the moment, there are all sorts of databases worldwide. In fact, there's a recent cataloging exercise which Louise Arsenault at King's has carried out, which I direct you to. But we need to have tools which have the kind of granularity and linkage to really answer the questions we have based around the pathways into and out of mental health problems, for example. Harmonization of measures. Now, that's something which I can speak to because when I was editing Lancet Psychiatry, we might get 6 or 7 papers in the same week, and they'd all be about depression, and they might all be treatments for depression, and they'd all be using different scales, and they might even be using different cutoffs for the scales. So the point would come when I'd go to the rest of the editorial board and say, well, I think these papers are pretty interesting. I think we should publish them. The reviews are good. And one of my colleagues would say, okay, well, what does that scale mean? What does the point change mean? And it was a somewhat bewildering experience, I think, for a lot of people. So the problem is at the moment that if we're using all sorts of different measures in terms of mental health, we have issues of clarity in terms of communicating research. We also have issues in terms of combining those data into things like meta-analyses. It just makes it that bit harder. And then the other thing is that there's an element of trust. There's always that suspicion that people have that people might be choosing scales in mental health to give positive results statistically, which aren't that relevant clinically. So what we need to do is to have at least agreement on some minimal set of measures, not that we necessarily need to use as primary outcomes, but which should be taken in pretty much any study to allow us to really accelerate progress. And then finally, field building, which is my particular domain, and which I'm just going to put up on the next slide what we're doing there. This is how we see the field. I'd be interested to know if you see it differently. But mental health is a great field. I think the sheer diversity of individuals and of disciplines in mental health is a real strength. However, it also has certain problems. One of the problems is this siloing across different disciplines, that there are not many theories of everything in mental health, that we have people who are in different disciplines who are not necessarily being given the incentives or the facilities to see how their research joins at the edges, how we can get a very complete picture of how mental health problems evolve and develop and resolve from maybe looking at the same thing from all the angles as opposed to just one. And then also there's this issue of lived experience that we really do need to hear the voices of people who are affected by mental health problems. And I'll go into that in a slide in a moment. So our aim here in field building is that we want to foster an international and collaborative field of mental health science that really makes it much easier to collaborate, to find collaborators, to work on multidisciplinary projects that can really find the big answers to the big questions. And part of that, of course, involves embedding lived experience. The second big problem is this problem of coherence. Now, I mentioned common metrics as one problem. Another problem, for example, is shared definitions. So if you're talking about what, say, treatment resistance consists of, there are all kinds of definitions for that. How can we arrive on a set of common definitions, which mean that we all vaguely speak the same language so that the field does cohere in that way? How do we understand the history of mental health science? What's the narrative around that? What lessons can we learn from it? There are lots of elements to this coherence of the field. And our aim there is that we go from this field, which at the moment is rather patchwork in terms of coherence, to one where we have a shared understanding, or we're moving towards at least a shared understanding of concepts, of definitions, of metrics, that we understand the plurality of these points of view, but nevertheless, we are actively trying to build and to share understanding where we can. And the third thing is focus. Now, this again, I'm afraid to say, speaks to my experience as a journal editor, which is perhaps because we haven't had anything fantastically new and paradigm shifting in mental health for such a long time, there tends to be a movement towards whatever's big and what will get you publications. And I completely understand the pressure to do that. So we tend to think that the next big thing, the next silver bullet, the next solution for everything. And you see that mental health can be quite swayed by whatever the trend is at the time. And that's very understandable. But what I'd like to see, what my colleagues would like to see, is really much more shared focus. So we can see key areas of promise, we can agree what those are. We have a very structured approach to identifying what the key research questions are that we need to ask, that we take, say, a potential new treatment, we can identify it, we can identify what the key questions are, we can move that through to a phase 2, to a phase 3, we can then make a decision on whether there's anything here to pursue or whether we need to now leave that and move on to something else. And we do that in a much more evidence-driven and efficient way than we are at the moment. Now, the next slide is about lived experience, which I mentioned. So the image here is from a Wellcome photography prize from a couple of years ago, which included an element of mental health lived experience. Now, there are all kinds of ethical reasons to include lived experience, and I would in no way diminish those at all. It's very important that, especially given the history of mental health science, that we make really active moves to include and to listen to the voices of people with experience of mental health problems. But I'd also say that there's a very good practical reason to do so. My personal journey with lived experience probably starts back when I was in practice, and I saw the good work which Mind Advocates did on the wards in Camden and Islington. But then also, I remember over 10 years ago now, I was editing a paper which was a meta-analysis on the prevention of relapse by antipsychotic drugs. And it showed that they did indeed prevent relapse, but the authors commented they didn't have a lot of data on things like quality of life and employment and relationship status, which it struck me would actually be rather important to someone who was taking these drugs, which are often quite hard to take, and how much stronger and robust the evidence base would be, and how much better psychiatrists would be able to inform patients about the pros and the cons of taking medications if there had been a greater lived experience voice in these primary studies to look at what antipsychotics actually do clinically. That's just one example. I'm sure that you can think of all kinds of other examples where having that voice of just experience, and by this I don't just mean the stories, but I mean that sort of particular expertise which experience gives you in framing and prioritizing the kinds of questions which mental health science needs to answer. So a quick slide on our remit. What will we fund? Well, the first thing to say is for the international audience that the mental health area, our calls are open to anyone, anywhere in the world, provided you're not currently, provided that you're allowed to from your point of view, and provided you're not sanctioned by the UK at the moment, you can apply for funding. We'll fund whatever works. We'll fund research from subcellular to social. We are interested in clinical research. What we won't do, unfortunately, is fund research which is outside this area of anxiety, depression, and psychosis. As I mentioned, discovery research will still fund things within those areas. We also expect you to meaningfully involve people with lived experience. We do have already a set of core measures. I talked about the common measures earlier. We have a set of common measures which we would like you to collect as part of your study. Those are not very onerous. For depression, it's PHQ-9. For anxiety, it's GAD-7. For disability, it's HUDAS, and I think for younger populations, it would be ARCADS. We're currently in the process of identifying the psychosis metrics, but those are not, I think, hugely onerous scales to include as outcomes. And that really is about it. That's all that you need to know. What I'm going to do now is just talk you through the specifics of some of our funding calls over the past year and some upcoming calls. And then also I'm going to talk about an example of a field building project which recently launched, which might be of interest to you. So research calls, this is an example of the diversity of things which we fund. So in 2022, we had calls on cognitive and functional outcomes in psychosis. We also had what was called looking backwards, moving forwards. You remember what I said about us needing to figure out how interventions worked? Well, that's part of that particular aspect of things, which is saying, okay, if we're saying how might antidepressants work, how might psychotherapies work, how might other treatments work, what's the active ingredients there that we can learn a bit more and refine to everyone's benefit. Also sleep, very important transdiagnostic issue. So there was a funding call on sleep. There's a funding call which is open at the moment, which I'm going to go into more detail in on the next slide, which is about stratification with regard to anxiety and depression. So I'll just mention that there, but I'll cover it in detail in the next slide. What's coming up? Well, in 2023, pathways to and through anxiety is one. We're also developing a call specifically focused on neuroscience. I know that looks like a pretty vague title at the moment, unlocking the potential of neuroscience to help illuminate and resolve anxiety, depression, and psychosis. We will be probably refining that call quite a bit before we launch it. But that is a specific neuroscience focused call, which will be coming out hopefully later in the year. And then next year, there's going to be a call on digital technology to aid early intervention in anxiety, depression, and psychosis. Now, just to say, these are not a secret. We do like to keep them up to date. And as we refine these calls, we will put details on our website. So you can go to our website. You will be able to find details of our upcoming calls there. And also, if you have any suggestions for anything which we're not covering, which you think we should cover, we have a suggestions box as well, which we check every week. So please feel free to go there and drop us a suggestion as well. We're trying to be as transparent as we can around this and also to learn together with the mental health community. So here's an example of one of our calls as to how much money is in it and how it works. This is the stratification call, which is just about still open. The deadline is 7th of June. The aim of this call is to support validation of biological, psychological, social, or digital markers, so pretty broad, to enable stratification in anxiety and or depression as soon as possible. The level of funding is up to 5 million per project, and each project can run up to 5 years. And you can, as I said, to reiterate, be based anywhere in the world. At the moment, if you're in mainland China, because of the local laws, you would not be able to apply for this funding, unfortunately. If your country is the target of international sanctions, that similarly precludes you. But otherwise, anywhere in the world, it's as with many of our calls, there are 2 stages, and the first stage is a preliminary application stage. And as I say, you've got a little bit of time left for that one, up to the 7th of June. Now, if you want to look online on our website, you'll see we have all kinds of supporting material about this. We have written information, we have webinars, and so please do have a look if you're interested in this call. So field building, these are some of the things which we've been working on over the past year. And these include the Common Metrics Commission, where we have commissioned a supplier to look at the common metrics which have been chosen and to road test them and to provide a handy roadmap for their implementation. Evidence synthesis, which I will talk about further in a moment. And then a few quite short but quite interesting projects. There's one called Transdisciplinary Concepts, and the idea is there that we're working to look at people who are outside the field of mental health and to see if they have any bright ideas from their particular scientific disciplines which might apply to mental health science. I think a lot of the time in mental health, we think that our problems are unique to us, and many of those problems are, but it's also the case maybe that if you cast your net a bit wider, you'd see that other people have similar issues with things such as diagnosis, with things such as managing the sheer complexity of mental health problems, there are other fields which could maybe help us a bit with that. So we're seeing if that's possible. Transdiagnostic targets. This is not an anti-diagnosis project, but it is to acknowledge that a lot of the time, many of the things which are pivotal in people's mental health do cut across diagnoses. I mentioned sleep earlier, that would be one. There's also say suicidality, that's another. So we're looking for these targets which really cross over between anxiety, depression, and psychosis, and really trying to just gather together the evidence on those. And that, again, is a fairly short project, and we have just commissioned some people to write us reviews on those. History of causes, which is the more cultural side of things. We know that there are all kinds of causes have been proposed for mental health problems over the past century or so. Some of them have stuck, some of them haven't, some of them have been hugely popular and then diminished, others have maybe been forgotten and could do with a revival. So we have commissioned a multidisciplinary team led by a historian to really look into the history of what people have proposed as the causes of mental health problems, and to see what we might learn from that today. And that will hopefully be out later in the year. With the research environment team at Wellcome, who are concerned with how research is done, we have commissioned a scoping exercise on the bioethics of future mental health research. And there's also a project where we're in the process of commissioning at the moment, which is really looking at these debates in mental health science, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, scoping what these debates are and seeing if there's any way that we can move forward with, if not agreement, perhaps managed disagreement to unlock progress. Now I'm just going to give you an example of a field building project. And this is the kind of project which I'm very keen on, which is that I think that we need to look very deeply about what is structurally happening with the mental health field, and to look at large scale, hopefully sustainable projects which will address those very specific problems. Now, I mentioned the problem earlier of mental health science being a little bit trend driven, about the fact that what we need to do is to really look at the evidence and use that to generate good research questions and to really move potential new treatments forward to either the clinic or, you know, to being put back on the shelf. But we need to do that in a much more systematic way, I think, than we're doing at the moment. So this is the evidence synthesis project. And the idea here is to really use the ability of technology to help us to review the evidence. Technology has been the blessing and the curse of medical research in general. It means there's a lot of it available, but it also means there's a lot of it available. And it's very hard to manage. And it's very hard to, of many thousands of papers in mental health science alone, to really pull out the signal as to what the most promising areas are, to drill down into those, to say, okay, on the basis of this evidence, what are the specific questions that we need to answer? And then to keep that updated enough. So say when I was, again, when I was editing, of course, we publish systematic reviews and meta-analyses, but we would not tend to publish one on the same topic more frequently than every 5 years. That seems to be a rule of thumb across the industry. These things take a while to do, they take a while to review. So if you were doing a research project and you were saying, okay, let's look at the latest systematic evidence in the field, you might be dealing with something that's 6 or more years out of date. So the idea of this is that we're going to review the evidence, and it's going to be done on a living basis. So it's not just going to be reviewed once with that initial heft, but we're then going to use the latest digital and AI tools to keep those reviews updated. So we're going to look at specific areas. We're then going to work with experts by experience, people with lived experience, to identify and frame the pivotal research questions which come out of those syntheses of the evidence. What we're then going to do is make sure that all of that is free. So it will all be free online. I'll give you the website in a moment so you can have a look. And the idea here is that we'll have papers which are going to be published through Wellcome Open Research, but also a website where you can really see this process is completely transparent. One of the unfortunate trends I've seen in mental health over the past few years has been what I'd call the weaponizing of systematic reviews, where systematic reviews are designed to prove a point rather than to evaluate the evidence. We're going to make sure that you can check the workings of everything which this project does, completely open, completely transparent. And what we hope is that this will help with that focus goal I mentioned earlier, enabling the field to cohere around a common agenda. So this is the scope of the evidence synthesis project. What we're looking for is the diagnostic, prognostic and predictive tools, so stratification, in other words, pharmacological and non-pharmacological interventions. We're interested in everything from foundational up till about phase 2. That's about 24 reviews in total on specific topics. And the first outputs, I hope, I trust and hope, will be out in late October. So you'll be able to get those completely free. If you want to learn more about the project, you can go to the website, which is Galanos, which is, of course, the Greek way of saying Galen, the great physician. And if you are a fan of elaborate acronyms in medical research, and who isn't, you can see that stands for the Global Alliance for Living Evidence on Anxiety, Depression, and Psychosis. And it's a truly international collaboration. I don't have time to show you the map, but if you go to the Galanos website, galanos.org.uk, you can see who's involved in this. It's led by Oxford University, but it's got collaborators from all kinds of institutions all over the world. And I hope that this will mark a change in the way that we approach mental health research and in the way that we approach the evidence base on which we conduct research, and reduce waste and really improve the efficiency so we can make progress a lot faster than it has been, which is very, very badly needed indeed. So that's everything. I've spoken for almost 40 minutes, I think. So that's all I have to present in terms of slides. But if you have any questions or any points for discussion or anything that you think we should consider in Wellcome Mental Health, please do go ahead. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now.
Hey, thank you very much, Niall. That was fascinating. You've covered so much, such a big area there, and it's really interesting also to see how your experience as a clinician and as a journal editor has influenced what you're hoping to achieve through Wellcome. A reminder that you can put your questions in the Q&A below, or you can raise your hand and we'll bring you into the call. So maybe I can start now. You didn't mention anything about the timescale here. You obviously have very ambitious plans here, and you're starting to build projects and deliver. What is there an endpoint? What's the thinking on timelines?
Well, I think that the thing to say is that this is not a little project. This is a strategic goal of Wellcome, and looking at the various documentation around the reorganization and so on, I'd say that this is a project of at least 10 years. And we do expect to get new treatments out of it. So, it's, on the one hand, it's quite a long time scale, it sounds like, but it's also quite an ambitious time scale in terms of what we want to achieve. One of the big criticisms, I think, of mental health science, mental health research has been its failure to, quote, move the needle. Has been the idea that it's good at producing, cool papers and interesting things, but as for actually putting things into motion, which are going to be new treatments to change people's lives, not so good at that. So we're hoping that the way in which we're focusing the problem and the way in which we're prioritizing what we're prioritizing with the various support activities will mean that we don't just come up with interesting stuff, but we actually have things which are going to move into the clinic and are going to change the treatment of anxiety, depression, and psychosis.
Oh, that's fantastic, but very, very ambitious. I mean, 10 years for a new treatment is not very long, is it, in the history of new treatments for mental health disorders?
It's not. I mean, what we'd say there is we aim to have we aim to have things underway. I'm,
Okay.
and of course there are some things which are already in motion. For instance, you've seen that CAR-XT, new antipsychotic with muscarinic effects, interestingly, was did very well at trial, and that was funded by Wellcome. So that's a success story already for Wellcome in terms of mental health.
Okay, oh, that's great.
And other examples, I guess, which Wellcome supported in the past include avatar therapy, which is based at King's, of course, which is a really amazingly innovative digitally based talking therapy.
Right. Oh, thank you for the highlighting King's. We're obviously very proud of that work and all the other work that we do. So there's two questions in the chat. Myrna Wiseman wants your email address, which I can sort out. But Veronique Briquet-Laugier, apologies Veronique if I've mispronounced your name, is asking about research projects focused or targeted to the patients and their caregivers to increase awareness and fight the taboo nature of mental health. Yeah,
that's an interesting question. Now, while specific anti-stigma programs would not be within our remit, of course, there have been great work in that area over the past decade, especially. Well, that isn't specifically within our remit. The thing I would stress is that that lived experience involvement is absolutely core to what we do. So it's not just that we like to talk about it, but we also have a head of lived experience alongside heads of translation and evidence and field building, which is me. We also have a head of lived experience. They have a team. We have lived experience advisors who are specifically employed in order to help us to develop projects. Any project which I work on, lived experiences there right at the beginning. So we are really trying to center that and to put that at the core, because I know that there's a terrible tendency for things to become a tick box, but I'm actually interested in how lived experience can shape our projects. So while, as I say, we're not specifically looking for anti-stigma, we hopefully one of the effects, the many beneficial effects of lived experience will possibly also be to reduce the stigma somewhat, and to really normalize having lived experience involved in your research in the same way that you'd expect to have a statistician involved in your research. I think you should also have someone with lived experience involved in it, and I think that should become part of the practice, commonly understood and really standard.
Right. And that certainly comes through in my recent applications to Wellcome, how core that is to everything that you do. And that's really valuable to see. Looking at the chat, I'm going to come to Myrna first, because she was first in the, Verna, you put your hand up and wanted to ask a question. Do go ahead. And then I'll come to you, Talia.
Is it working?
It is. We can hear you.
Oh, yep. My God, that's wonderful. It's sort of a general question. The pandemic has given us a lot of time at home, and I've used this time to collect chapters and information about the use of interpersonal psychotherapy, which is an evidence-based treatment all over the world. And I'm about tomorrow to send in to our publisher a book that will have reports from 30 countries like Nepal and Malaysia and Ethiopia and Senegal and Ukraine, etc. And now what I'm looking for is some way to begin to understand the commonalities and the differences, but this should be a research project. And I haven't quite framed, it's not research I'm used to doing. I'm used to doing clinical trials or observational studies. So I'd be interested in thoughts about how to frame this and where to go to get support for something like this.
Yeah, well, there are two things. The first thing is, clearly it's hard for me to comment on individual proposals in this kind of setting. What I'd say is that we are interested in, as I said, the active ingredients, the mechanisms. So it's worth looking at the various calls that we have, which are coming out, to see if there's anything which might be suitable there. If it's not covered and you think it's something we should cover, please, again, feel free to go to our website where we've got a suggestions box. You just push the button and you can send the suggestion in, and we'll have a look at it. But yeah, that
Okay,
as I say, we're always interested in the mechanism for things as well as the actual treatment. So yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Since the book is going out tomorrow, I'm looking for new ideas. It will be open access.
Oh, great.
So once it's out, it's about 700 pages. Once it's out, we can just send it to everybody by email.
Great.
We look forward to reading it, Myrna. Thank you for that question. And then I'm going to come to Talia Illy from King's College London, who is asking about the anxiety call, and if you can give a bit more information about the focus and the likely timings on that being announced.
Yeah, I think that the announcement's probably going to be over the next couple of months, but I'm not going to swear to that because things are always changing a bit in flux. As for the focus is pathways into and out of. So it's very much based on the evidence as to what I was saying earlier, which is that understand pillar, which is so understanding how people get into states of anxiety and how they emerge from those conditions. So that's all really I can say at the moment, although I seem to keep saying go to our website, but I'll say it again, go to our website, because we will put more details as they become available. And also it's very likely that there will be various support activities such as webinars and so on, which will go online with the call.
And just to, on that note on the webinars, just to reiterate that anyone who's applying for Wellcome funding, those webinars are fabulous in making sure that what you're applying for or how you're applying is a real match for what is looked for. So thank you for highlighting those. And then John Nornberger is asking about funding longitudinal cohort studies, for example, in adolescents at risk for onset of psychiatric illness.
I would say watch this space. We are certainly very interested in the power of longitudinal data and what data sets are out there and what is needed in the field, be that new data sets, enrichment of current data sets. That's something which we are actively looking into with interest. The first port of call, although you're probably familiar with it, is the cataloging exercise, which Louise Arsenault and colleagues have just completed. So that should be on the web. But that itself is a fantastic resource. There are so many databases of which I must admit I knew very little. And they've done a great job in gathering all of that information together.
Yeah, that's going to be a fantastic resource, and we're really excited to at King's to have been leading on that. We've got to the end of the questions in the Q&A list. If there's anyone that has further questions, you can either type or you can put up your hand. I think I've now figured out how to see that. While people are thinking, is there anything else you wanted to say, Niall?
The thing that I'd say is, that I and all my colleagues are really very, very open to discussion and to suggestions. This is a learning process for us. We are trying to be open and transparent with that. And I'm always interested in hearing what people have to say. So always feel free to tweet me or drop me an email or use our suggestions box. That's absolutely fantastic. As I say, I think that my concern is that we don't just come up with interesting research, but we look at the whole structure of the field in a way that will help us to move these interesting questions actually through to clinical practice. And that's what our calls are geared towards. And if you have any thoughts on how we could do that differently or better, please do let us know. I know that from when I was working at the Lancet, from the outside, the Lancet always seems like this intimidating institution, and I was always very keen to break down that sort of mental barrier, and that's something I'm very keen of with Wellcome as well, which is to say, we are completely open and we are learning, and I'm very interested to hear what people have to say.
Thank you. That's probably
Thank you.
very...
I think people are distracted by the very nice coffee and cake, which is on Grace's screen.
I think this is a Swedish coffee and cake.
Ah, very nice.
I forget the name of it.
Yeah.
So, yes. Right. I see no further questions in Q&A. So you've obviously been really clear and answered everyone's questions there. And I can't see any hands up. We will finish there. Thank you very much, Niall. I've learnt a huge amount. I thought I was reasonably well informed with what Wellcome we're doing here, but you've been really insightful, both about the long-term vision and the details of what's coming up. And I can see that we've had all sorts of people from all around the world listening in. So I think you've been very successful in getting Wellcome's vision out around the globe.
That's a pleasure, and I look forward to working with all of you.
Great. Thank you very much, Niall. And a reminder that for anyone who missed it, the webinar will be up on YouTube shortly. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.